I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Research and Studies at the University of Georgia and the Duckworth Library at Young Harris College. We are honored to have as our guest today Andrew Young, civil rights icon, 3-term congressman from Atlanta, 2-term mayor of Atlanta, and United States ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome.
Very good.
I'd like to ask you before we begin how I should address you.
Any way you want to.
Reverend, Congressman, Mayor, Ambassador, or Andy?
Andy.
Andy. Very well, Andy. You were born in New Orleans during the Depression. Your father was a dentist, your mother was a school teacher. Your father wanted you to be a dentist, but you became a minister. What happened?
I realized that I loved medicine and I loved science, but I evolved very quickly. I did not want to spend my life around a dentist chair. I liked the dentistry, but I didn't like the confinement of the dentist office. And I realized that a lot of people were sick, not for medical reasons, but for spiritual reasons. And I basically evolved from dentistry to medicine, got interested in psychology and psychiatry, but realized that even psychiatry is essentially a result of people not knowing who they are. And that when you see yourself as God's child, and when you understand the nature of your creation and your being, and you understand that you were created by a loving creator who forgives you and accepts you as you are, that sort of takes care of most of your problems. And so I really ended up believing that it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save men's souls. And I still believe that. But I went down to Thomasville and Beachton, Georgia, first in 1954 as a summer pastor. And that very first summer, one of my members and his wife had a fight. And it was the day before I was supposed to do a Mother's Day sermon. And I realized that they were good people, but he came home drunk, and she didn't like his being drunk. And when I looked into it, the reason he was drinking was that he was working on one of the plantations down there in Thomas County. And he'd been working there for 20, 25 years. And a young white boy came in from University of Georgia and had been working with him for a week. And he was training him, and when they got paid, the young white boy got paid twice as much as he was paid. And he realized that this was terribly disrespectful, but he also realized that this young boy was being trained to take his job and put him out of work. He didn't know what to do about it. He got drunk. And when I got to the bottom of that, I still preached my Mother's Day sermon, but I had to put it into a social context, that I can't preach that people are God's children Sunday morning, have them believe it, and then they go to work Monday morning and they're treated like second-class citizens. So that was what led me into the understanding of the relationship to civil rights and religion. Now, about that same time, Maynard Jackson's grandfather, John Wesley Dobbs, invited me to a meeting up in Columbus and asked me to do a voter registration drive. And I agreed. And we set it up for a certain date that next spring. And I went back to seminary in Connecticut for a semester, and then I came back in January. So by the time I came back, it was 1955. And I was running a voter registration drive, but when we were driving from Albany to Thomasville in the back road through Moultrie. We came around the corner curve on the road right outside of Dole Run, Georgia. And I came around that curve in my little Nash Rambler, and with my wife and my baby in the bassinet. And lo and behold, I found myself in the middle of a gathering of Klansmen. And I wasn't afraid, and I just slowed down and eased on through. But there must have been, in that afternoon, 100 or so people already gathered. And I realized that they were probably coming to march on Thomasville to harass us for the voter registration drive. Well, by that, I had been in seminary, and that's right after the Second World War. Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich and all of the great theologians were really chastening America and Europe for not taking Hitler on. And so the prevailing religious doctrine was negotiation from a position of strength. And so I decided to tell my wife that, look, we have a little clapboard house here. If somebody throws a match on it, much less a Molotov cocktail on the front porch, the whole thing goes up in smoke and we're done for. So I said, but if they come here, I'm going to go down and talk to them. But I want you to sit in the window with the rifle. And I want you to point it at the guy that I'm talking to, and then I can negotiate from a position of strength. If something happens to me, something's going to happen to him. And my wife had gone to school, and she was from Marion, Alabama, same little town Coretta Scott King was from. And they had both gone to schools where they taught peace studies at Antioch, where Coretta went, and Jean went to Manchester College, Church of the Brethren College, where she had to take a required course in New Testament nonviolence. And she said, I'm not going to point a gun at a human being. I said, come on, we're talking about the Ku Klux Klan. And she said, yeah, but you have to remember, and if you don't remember it, you don't need to be preaching, that under that sheet is the heart of a child of God. I said, damn, woman, what is the matter with you? And she said, well, if you don't believe it, you ought not be preaching. We just need to fold up our tents and go find another job, because it doesn't get any more basic than that. Well, I was at first angry and then realized she was right. So I called some of the other leaders in town, and we agreed that we'd go see the mayor. All this was we got back about 3 o'clock, and we figured the Klan would be in town by 7 or 8 o'clock. So this was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and so we went down to the hardware store to see Mayor Watt and explained to him what we thought was going to happen. And he got on the phone and he called the managers of Sunnyland Packing Company and Flowers Bakery that was still there. And he said, we're going to have a Klan meeting here, but we don't want any trouble. And so they got on their plant microphones and they encouraged their workers not to attend the Klan rally. And they told the sheriff that he needed to beef up his forces, let the Klan have their meeting on the steps of the courthouse, but they do not give them permission to ride through the community and harass any of our citizens. And that was a very powerful lesson to me. One, it was that you could work with a business community, and the business community would leverage the sheriff. And I think that incident set in motion the way I viewed my life, because everything I did here in Atlanta, we did with the business community. And the business community by and large, understood about the same time in the 50s, particularly after Little Rock and in 59, and Eisenhower had to send the troops in, 58, 59, that bad race relations were bad for business. And so Mayor Hartsfield got together with the business community, and they went out and formed a partnership with the academic community at Atlanta University, Morehouse Spelman, and we have worked together with the business community to move Atlanta forward. But that came from us, but that was a lesson I learned down in Thomasville and Beachton. Mm-hmm. I also remember down there that we had a very good hospital, still do, Archibald Memorial Hospital. And I had no health insurance. And my wife's expecting a baby, so I'd been saving my money. I wasn't making but $190 a month. And $100 of that was expenses for the church and my travels and everything else. And but I had $50 that I heard that you needed a $50 deposit to get in the hospital. So I went in, got my wife in the hospital. 2 days later, when she checked out, I went back to see how much I owed and could I work out some kind of payment plan. And they said, oh, you had no complications and your wife had natural childbirth, so she didn't even use any anesthetic. And they gave me $18 back. Now, that was supposed to be the conservative South back then. But under Senator Lister Hill from Alabama, we had the Hill-Burton hospitals all across the nation, because the government believed that small towns and poor people ought to have good health care. And now, conservatives seem to think that health care ought to be something that everybody takes for themselves. But well, my son had a child here. This is 50 years later, but still no complications and wonderful baby. But out at Piedmont Hospital, the bill was $9,000. You know, you couldn't. I couldn't have survived with that kind of life. You know, and there's still people down in Thomasville and here in Atlanta. At $200 a month is a lot of money. But you cannot possibly buy food, gas, and take care of medical care. And so I think that partially because I was born in the Depression, partially because I can remember hearing Franklin Roosevelt say on the radio that we have nothing to fear but fear itself, you know, after Pearl Harbor. And so I was pretty much shaped by my childhood and my early life. In that neighborhood in New Orleans, there was a Irish grocery store, an Italian bar on the next corner, and across the street from the Italian bar was the Nazi Party headquarters. And so I am 3, 4 years old, listening to people Heil Hitler. And my daddy had to explain that to me, see. And he took me to the movies to see Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. And when Jesse Owens won his first race, Hitler got up and walked out of the stadium rather than give him the medal. And my daddy said, see, but Jesse didn't get mad. He just went on and broke 3 more records. And he always said, white supremacy is a sickness. And you don't get mad with sick people. You try to figure out a way to help them. And that was the way I was taught to live in this diverse and sometimes hostile community. I was also taught to stand up and fight. And my daddy's attitude was, if you know how to fight, you don't have to fight. And the one thing you can't be, and be a man is be a coward. See? So it's better to fight and get whipped than not to fight. See? But at the same time, he always said, your most powerful weapon in a fight is your brain. And don't get mad. If you get mad in a fight, you lose the fight. And because your mind is the most powerful weapon you have. And so he used to say to me all the time, don't get mad, get smart. And we would box, shadow box. And we would circle, and if he'd tap me on the cheek, but if I got mad and started swinging wild, he'd slap me good. He said, see, that's what happens when you start losing your temper. And so I had a very good childhood and upbringing. And it was the church, it was the YMCA, Boy Scouts, family, and I always felt very comfortable and secure, and race wasn't a problem to me. You know, I was very proud to be who I was, and the only time it bothered me, 2 times when I was growing up, and because of my admiration of Jesse Owens, I figured I was supposed to be a runner too, and I couldn't get in the track meets at City Hall, at the city stadium, because they didn't let black people in them. And I would read the times in the paper and realize that I could run faster than that. And I even got a stopwatch, and I'd get my brother we'd measure off the distance, and he'd tell me to go, and I would prove to myself that I could run faster than the guys that were written up in the paper as being the fastest runners in New Orleans. And the other thing was, we had a roller coaster out on Lake Pontchartrain, and it would bother me that I'd ride past that roller coaster and I couldn't get on it. But other than that, that was the most difficult racial problems I had. And New Orleans was a kind of funny place where skin color and the quality of your hair made a difference. But I always thought of that as kind of childishly ignorant. I just basically grew up feeling very comfortable and blessed.
Off to college at Howard. At age 15.
Yeah, well, I went to Dillard first at 15. Then Dillard was right across the street from my house. And so that next summer, I went out to California, to the University of Southern California. But I was the only black person on that campus. I didn't even see any black people cutting grass. And I took botany, and I did pretty well, but I didn't want to stay in school out there. So I came back at the end of the summer, and I went to Howard University, where I finished.
And then what happened?
Then on the way back from Howard, I realized that I had a college degree. I was supposed to be a man. I was really just 19. And I realized that I didn't know anything and I hadn't done anything. And that basically I had a ball in college, and I was on the track team and the swimming team, and enjoyed fraternity life and studied just enough to get by. But I figured I had wasted an opportunity. And so coming back from Howard, we had to stop in North Carolina, because in those days you couldn't stay in hotels. So we stopped at a church conference in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. And we were going all the way to New Orleans. And my parents wanted to stay at the church conference, and I wasn't much interested in the church. but I went for a run. And we were at Kings Mountain and Crowder Mountain there, and I saw the mountain up ahead, and I'd been on the swimming team all winter and the track team all spring, and I was in very good condition. And I'd literally pushed myself running to the top of that mountain. And when I got there, I was just exhausted and couldn't breathe. And but as I sat up there on the top of that mountain, I had closest thing I've ever had to a religious experience. And there was just a sudden awareness that everything I looked out on had a purpose. You know, there was a place and a purpose and an order to the mountains and the trees and the cornfields and the wheat fields or whatever they were growing. I just realized that if everything in life had a purpose, then there had to be a purpose for me too. And I came down for that mountain feeling like God must have a purpose for my life. And I didn't know what it was, but I was going to be patient. And you know, we used to sing in Sunday school, "Where he leads me, I will follow." So I just decided to let go and let God. And I think from then on, I haven't had a problem. My pastor, when I came back, we had a new pastor who had just graduated from Yale Divinity School, and he was just about 7 years older than me. So he asked me to go with him out to Texas to he was going to speak at an interracial conference. And he was from the North, had never been in the South, and he asked me to drive with him because he didn't know how to act and where to go. And so I drove with him out to Lake Brownwood, Texas. That's up in the Texas Panhandle. And my plan was to go to San Antonio to have a party with my roommate from college and leave him with the church conference. But when we got there, it was so far out in the woods. San Antonio was the next big town, but it was almost 200 miles away. And we had not seen anybody black since we left Houston. And he didn't want to stay there by himself. And so I ended up staying there with him. And it was the first time I had met white young people whose life was significantly changed by their Christian faith. They all had some purpose in life. Many of them were planning to go to India or Africa or Latin America as missionaries. They were at a conference with black people, and in one of our evening sessions, one young lady broke down and cried and said that her father was the sheriff of one of the nearby counties, and if he knew that she was in the conference with black people, he would, he'd disown her. He wouldn't pay a college tuition. He just put her out. And I said, well, why did you come? And it was because she said, because of what I believe about Jesus Christ. Well, I'd never known people to run risks. Everybody that I knew was Christian because it was the most comfortable and respectable thing to do or be. And here were young people who were accepting the challenges of faith and willing to run the risk because of their beliefs. So at the end of that conference, they asked for volunteers to work in Christian youth work for a semester. And there was nobody else black there, and they wanted it to be an interracial experience. So they asked me, I didn't volunteer, but they asked me would I be willing to serve, and I said, I guess so. And they assigned me to Hartford, Connecticut. And I had a little English for it. I had a little savings account from the early days when we bought defense bonds, and people used to give you war bonds for your birthday and things like that. So I had a couple of $100 saved before I went to college, and somebody came to try to sell my daddy some mutual funds, and he said he didn't have any money to invest. All of his investment was in sending his boys to college. And so I said, well, could you take these defense bonds and invest them? Well, it was about somewhere $200-300 that I'd accumulated. And so I put it in defense bond. I put it in mutual funds. I cashed them in. And then when I came out of college 3 years later, it had multiplied to over $500. And so I cashed them in, and that's what I bought my first car for. I think it was $650. It was a little English Ford. So I bought this little car, and I drove on up to Connecticut. Well, when I got there, they didn't have a place for me to stay. And they called up the seminary and asked if they had any extra rooms. So they put me in a guest room at the seminary, at Hartford Seminary Foundation. And it was a beautiful place, and I had a nice room, and I decided if I was going to be there, most of my work was in the evenings after 3 o'clock and at night. And so I went into the dean's office and asked if I could take a few classes. I said, I don't know anything about the Bible, and I'd really like to know a little about the New Testament and the Old Testament. And he said, well, if you could take 3 classes, I could offer you a scholarship. And I said, well, sure. So I added philosophy of religion and enrolled in seminary. And I liked it because it was small and very good teachers. And instead of lecturing, I'd been in big classes, 200-300 people at Howard. Here I was in, I don't think classes were normally about 20 or less, but I also had some classes where there were only 3 or 4 of us. In fact, the best class I think I've ever had, we had 3 teachers and 5 students. And the 5 students were one, a young Japanese, had been a Navy lieutenant in the Japanese Navy. This is right after the Second World War. We had a young man from South Africa who was an anthropologist trying to get a doctorate. We had another young fellow from Europe. And my roommate, he was a white Southern Baptist from Guilford College in North Carolina, and I was from Louisiana. And so the 5 of us would meet for 3 hours every Friday. And we'd just talk about anything we wanted to talk about. And then they would give us assignments to read based on what our conversations were. So it was the best education model I could have conceived. And so I was very comfortable there for 3 years and did very well.
Your first call was to Marion, Alabama.
That's right. And it was, I realized later, my mother didn't like me being in New York. I had signed up, I had a job in New York City for the summer, and I was planning to run with the Pioneer Track Club to train for the 1952 Olympics. And my mother, I found out later, called the conference superintendent and asked if he couldn't find a place for me back down south somewhere. And my father and I had a kind of he was very disappointed that I wouldn't be a dentist. And when I ended up saying I was going to go to seminary, he said, well, I'm not going to waste my money on, sending you to. He said, all the preachers I know are either poor or crooked, and I don't want you to be either. And so we kind of had a break. I said, well, okay, that's fine. I'll make it somehow on my own, and I did. I had eventually 4 jobs up there in seminary. After this volunteer work, I got a job in the kitchen washing dishes. My roommate and I took care of, or janitors of a little apartment a couple of blocks from the campus where we had to clean the halls and fire the furnace every night and haul out the ashes every morning. And I worked in the bookstore, and I had a church on Sundays, doing youth work for and helping to found an interracial church in Hartford, Connecticut. So I not only did better in my studies than I'd ever done before, but I was making more money than I'd ever had before. And so when they sent for me to go to Marion, Alabama, I was just devastated. But I had decided that I was going to do that. If God had a purpose for me, that the best way to find that purpose was if there was something that nobody else wanted to do or nobody else could do, then that was probably for me. And everybody could run for the Olympics, and everybody could have worked in New York in a settlement house. But there wasn't anybody, and that's what the conference superintendent said, I can't find anybody to go to this little church in Marion, Alabama. And they haven't had a pastor for the last 4 years. And if I don't send somebody there now, church was falling down. So reluctantly, I agreed to go. I went back through Washington, and the girl that I'd been halfway engaged to didn't want anything to do with the South. If I'd been in New York, she was going to come up and spend some time with me in New York. So we broke up. And probably the best thing that happened to me, but I didn't think so at the time. I just felt that I was rejected and that nobody, but I literally cried driving all the way down through Georgia to Alabama. But when I got to Alabama, I went to the house where I was supposed to get my meals, and on the coffee table in the living room was a Bible, and it was underlined, and there were all of these scriptures that I liked. And I said, whose Bible is this? And she said, that's my daughter's Bible. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. I'd never met any girls that read the Bible before. But then there was a senior life-saving certificate on the wall, and I'd been on the swimming team. And then there was a basketball letter. So I said, who are these for? And she said, oh, that's my daughter too. I said, you got 3 daughters? She said, well, all of these belong to my baby daughter. So I had not even met her, and I decided then God sent me here to marry this woman.
Is it true that the first time you met her, she was milking a cow?
First time I went to her house, she was milking a cow. I had met her, she was taking care of her little nieces and nephews while her brother's wife had a baby in Tuskegee. So she wasn't there for the first week I was there. And when I came, I went to Tuskegee to meet her and came back with her. But the first time I went to her house, she was milking her cow. And I was very insensitive, but I thought it was absolutely a beautiful picture. And I went back to my car to get my camera, and she got mad. And she saw the city slicker making fun of a little country girl milking a cow. So I didn't get off to a good start. But it didn't matter because I just felt that this was what God sent me here for. Now, interestingly enough, that's where Coretta King came from, same little town. And Juanita Abernathy was from the same county.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but more interesting was that Coretta and her family had studied at Antioch College, which was the only place where they had peace studies. And Manchester College, you had a required course in nonviolence in the New Testament. Now, neither Martin King nor I had ever studied nonviolence. Had only heard of it through Gandhi. But they were much more grounded in nonviolence than we were. And they were also, they had had much more bitter experiences with race in Marion, Alabama than Martin had in Atlanta or I had in New Orleans. We'd been pretty much sheltered by middle-class parents. But to be an attractive young white black woman in the South can be hell. And Jean used to always wear baggy sweatshirts and jeans and would put her hair up under a cap. And she'd almost try to look like a boy. She had a bunch of 3 brothers, so she did have a nice little tomboy streak on her. No, 2 brothers and 3 sisters.
Well, after Thomasville, you took your family to New York.
Yeah, and again, there were no black executives at the National Council of Churches in New York, and they wanted to find somebody in youth work. And I had done Bible study at an interracial conference down in Florida, and they offered me the job. Now, Jean had never lived in a city. Marion is about 3,000. Manchester's about 3,000 people. Thomasville was back then about 10, 12,000 people. So we were very comfortable in the South and very much at home. And going to New York was really a shock. And it was more of a shock for her. I had been in Washington, New Orleans, and Hartford, Connecticut. Lived in Los Angeles for a summer, so I was pretty cosmopolitan. But it was, I mean, she had never seen an escalator before, and no reason why she should. But it was a real adjustment. And by the time we moved to New York, she had 2 babies, and her sister lived uptown in Harlem, and we lived downtown on 23rd Street when we first got there. And New York was interesting, but strangely enough, we had not felt segregated in the South. Now, we knew we were, but we knew our way around, so that living in Thomasville, when we went into Feinberg's furniture store, we figured we could pay $40 a month for furniture, and how much furniture could we get in 10 months? Because we didn't want to take a longer time than that. And people were so nice, they worked with us. We were trying to decide between a baby bed and a high chair, and Mr. Feinberg just said, go ahead, take them both, same price. And that was the way we were used to doing business with friends. And we got to New York, we felt real hostility. I mean, we had money then, and I was making a lot more money. $6,000 was a whole lot of money from $200 a month. Well, it was $190 a month, and then suddenly I'm making $6,000 a year. and we had saved some money. We went to buy a refrigerator, and the guy was so hostile that Jean started crying and said, I can't do this. And we walked out of the store. But it wasn't racial, it was just New York. But for a country girl with 2 babies to have to ride the subway up to Harlem to see her sister and not know where she's going. We were living in a cramped little apartment down in Lower East Side till we later on bought a house in Queens. But even that, when we went to get the house in Queens, my supervisor, my boss, lived in Queens, and he said that's a good neighborhood to live in. So we went out and we picked out a house and gave him the down payment. And it was almost a month, 2 months, and they were giving us the runaround on the mortgage. Well, my boss was from North Carolina, and he was a typical old-fashioned Southern gentleman. And he went with me to the bank. He said, now, Reverend Young works for the same people I do. And you gave me a mortgage in 3 or 4 days. And he's been waiting now almost 6 weeks. He said, if this was down south, I would think that race had something to do with it. But here in New York, I'm sure that that's not the case. And that's what it took for me to get a mortgage in New York. And so we had some real adjustments there. I was also working with the National Council of Churches, and my job was to try to help the churches relate to young people. And one of my tasks was to do a Sunday morning broadcast on CBS called Look Up and Live. So I got my start in television when I was about 25, 26 in New York. Well, no, let's see, in 1957. Yeah, I was 25. Mm-hmm. And it gave me a good experience working with a discipline of I had 1 minute to introduce a subject, and I had 90 minutes to conclude it. I mean, 1 minute and then 90 seconds to conclude it. And we had to develop a storyline of some sort to try to, it was a sort of a forerunner of reality TV, except we did script it. But it was typical kinds of complications and dramas that teenagers have, and suggesting a religious response rather than the normal secular response to the issue. And then I ended up doing a lot of traveling all over the country working with young people. But for instance, it was when I went to Little Rock, I didn't go to Little Rock to work with the black students who were integrating the schools. I went to Little Rock to work with the white students in the white churches to help them understand what was going on, and to help them realize that what these issues were. So I was working on the other side of the movement, and it was very good. It helped me later on. When we finally got that house, we had it about 3 years, and Nashville Sit-In Story came on, and we saw John Lewis and Martin Luther King and
Diane
Nash, James Bevel, and we decided right then it was time to come back home. Mm-hmm. And so I quit my job and put my house up for sale. thinking it would take, 6 months or so to work all this out. But everything moved very quickly. And I ended up quitting my job, had a buyer for my house. My wife was pregnant with a third child. She was finishing her master's at Queens College. And her dissertation was due the last week in May, and the baby was due the first week in June. And they wanted us out of the house by July. And so it all sort of worked out. And I ended up coming back to Atlanta and working with Martin Luther King. But that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in the movement and write about it. And I had first accepted a job at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. And after they offered me the job, the state of Tennessee closed it down. And so I had sold my house, I'd quit my job, my wife's got a baby, and a dissertation due, and I didn't know what to do. So I went to the church, the Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, and I remembered that when from my days in Thomasville, that we had a conference center, an old school near Savannah, in Liberty County. And I went to them and asked them, could we base our citizenship education program at Dorchester Center in Liberty County and move it from what had been in Highlander. And they said that they would do that, but they wanted me to go down and be the administrator of the project. So that's what put me in the office across the hall from Martin Luther King. But I was really on the church's payroll, but we were using office space with SCLC.
Is that the first time you met Dr. King?
Well, I had met him at Talladega College in 1957 when we both did, it was the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity had a religious emphasis week program and invited us both to come. And I say they invited him and figured he might cancel, so they invited me as a backup, but we both showed up. And we realized that our wives had come from the same little town, and on the way back to our church in Thomasville, we stopped in Montgomery and had dinner with he and Coretta. So I had known him. But I figured he was already, on the front of Time magazine, and he was a person of national stature, and so I was just awestruck. But when I came back to Atlanta and worked in the office there with him, there were only 3 or 4 staff people, and he was getting a lot of mail, so his secretary said, you're living in the YMCA, my family hadn't moved here yet, said, you got nothing to do at night, can you help Dr. King with his mail? So I said, sure. So that's how he and I got close. I would write out longhand letters, answers to his mail, and his secretary would type them up, and he liked the way I answered his mail. And more he began to ask me to help with things. And or he'd come to get me to do a little research on something. If he was going to speak at and I mean, one of the things that the church's work did for 4 years, it put me in, well, it sent me all over the world, sent me to Latin America, sent me to Europe a couple of times. In Europe, I met a lot of African leaders and in the World Council of Churches, and and then my work in New York was with CBS. So I had an understanding of media, and I had, different views from people all over the world. and by the time I got to SCLC, well, before Jean and I married, after we met, she was given a scholarship to go to Europe for the summer of 1953, and I decided to go with her. So we worked in 2 different work camps in Austria, and we hitchhiked around Europe. Her sister was in Berlin working with the YMCA and the USO, and so we went behind the Iron Curtain and to visit her sister in Berlin, and so I had a real good, rich orientation about the world when I came to work with Dr. King, and he realized that. And so when he was traveling abroad, or if he was doing something international, he'd usually ask me to, to help out with it.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about Dr. King.
Well, when the first time I came here and went to the office, he wasn't in the office. He was down at the church with his father, and I was supposed to have an appointment with him. And his secretary said, well, he's down there eating lunch with his daddy. Why don't you go on down there? So I went there, and they had a table between them, and his daddy was on one side and he was on the other side, and they had bath towels wrapped around their neck like napkins, and they were pouring over a pan of neck bones. And they were so deep into sucking those bones and eating lunch with their fingers that it was just a beautiful sight of father and son sharing a meal, but it was about as down to earth as you can get. And that was my first meeting with him on the staff, and we didn't talk about anything but the neck bones. But,
did you have a title with SCLC?
Well, my first title was administrator of the Citizenship Education Program, and I worked with Septima Clark, who was the director, and Dorothy Cotton, who was the director of education for SCLC. And the 3 of us ran this program, and we had a grant from the Marshall Field Foundation. So it was good in the sense that I was in SCLC, but I had an independent budget and an independent program that I managed. And but at the same time, I was well, I did everything I needed to do to help SCLC out. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about some of the activities of SCLC.
Well, when I first got here, what we did was we started in Atlanta, and we went up to Chattanooga to the SCLC convention, which was in August. And we drove from there over to Memphis and then down to Jackson, Mississippi. And we went down around Mississippi over to New Orleans, and then came back through southern Mississippi and Alabama. And what we were doing was recruiting people for our citizenship education program. And there were 2 things we were looking for. We were looking for the natural community leaders. Every community has somebody that everybody respects. And quite often, they're brilliant people. And we said these were people with PhD minds who never had a chance to go to college quite often. But they were brilliant people. And they were recognized, their leadership was recognized because of their astuteness and intelligence and experience. So those were the people we were looking for across the South. And we found them, and we took them over to Dorchester, and we gave them a week's training in nonviolence and in literacy training. We taught them how to teach their neighbors to read and write in order to register to vote. And we actually organized just about every county in South Carolina, about half the counties, any of the black majority counties across the South. That was basically where we concentrated. And all across the black belt of Alabama and Mississippi, and into Louisiana and East Texas, and as far north as Tidewater area of Virginia.
Let's talk now about some of the demonstrations that SCLC conducted in various places, Birmingham, St. Augustine, and the effect you think they had on the civil rights movement.
Well, as we began to recruit these folk across the South, when they got in trouble, they sent for us for help. And that was the way most of we didn't have a plan to change America. We were pulled into incidents by local people who needed help. And that was true in Albany, Georgia. It was true in later on in Birmingham and St. Augustine. We really went down there to try to stop that movement. But all of this was really the growing up of Martin Luther King. I mean, when he went to Montgomery, he had just turned 26. And he went there thinking that he was going to be able to stay out of politics and controversy. And he had a nice little conservative Baptist church, Dexter Avenue Church, with a lot of college professors in it. And he was finishing his PhD dissertation for Boston University. And a couple of weeks after he finished his dissertation and mailed it in, Rosa Parks sat down in the bus. And he ended up being the leader of the bus boycott, almost by default. Because he was the new guy in town and everybody else had some little factions, and the women in the community got together and said, look, these were mostly women who taught at Tuskegee University and Alabama State College, and they decided that they were the ones who were supporting Rosa Parks, and they decided that they wanted him to be the leader of the bus boycott. And it was fascinating because he didn't think of himself as going there to lead a movement. And the way I hear it, he was back at the back. He wasn't even the meeting. He was running a mimeograph machine, doing the handbills get out to the churches for the boycott. And they voted him the president. And he had about an hour to get a message together and no time to sit down and make notes or look up anything. He had to speak to the crowd that had formed on this boycott, around this boycott. And it's amazing if you listen to that sermon, which was recorded because Coretta was pregnant and couldn't get to the meeting, so she asked the music director at Alabama State, and he hauled one of those big, bulky two-wheel tape recorders over there and recorded the sermon. So we have it, and it was his first sermon with no notes and no time to prepare. But you saw in that, or you heard in that, all of the things that later developed the themes for the March on Washington, for the letter from the Birmingham jail, his Nobel Prize speech. Almost every speech he made, there was some little reference that you could trace to the future.
Mm-hmm. Julian Bond once said this to the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
King was the spear thrower, and Andy came behind him to put it all together. He could be a man on a tightrope, but he never slipped.
Well, that was very generous of him.
But that was very true.
Well, for instance, in Birmingham, we not only help to train the students, and when they say children, we were talking about high school students who were mostly 16 and up, who were going to Vietnam in 2 years. See, I mean, they ended up, they were going to have to be going abroad to fight for the draft in a couple of years. And so we felt like for them to fight for their own freedom at home. And we had a 14 and up, David Halberstam entitled the book "The Children." So people get the idea that these were 10, 11-year-olds, but they basically were pretty grown-up teenagers who took the lead in leading this movement. And we had training sessions for them at the high schools, at churches usually across the street from the high schools. Remember, there was no much television there. Kids didn't have much to do. So if we set up and showed the movie of the Nashville sit-in story, they'd all come. And so about every couple of times a week, we would have movies at a church on Gandhi and India, on the Nashville sit-in story. I guess those were the basic two that existed back then. Mm-hmm. And then we would have discussions and we would have workshops on nonviolence. Mm-hmm. So they knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And so by the time, April and May came around, they had been pretty much involved since early January and February in these workshops. And they basically took the leadership of the movement. Mm-hmm. The adults were trying to close it down. Now, my role was very simple because I had worked with the white churches at the National Council of Churches. When we came to Birmingham, I remembered the young white woman who was the diocesan youth director for Alabama. I'd met her at a conference in Michigan. And so I called and asked, could she set up a meeting with Dr. King and the bishop? And she said, well, I don't know Dr. King, but I know you. If you will come and meet with the bishop, maybe you can get him to agree. So I went down and we set up the first meeting between Reverend Abernathy, Dr. King, Reverend Shuttlesworth, with the Episcopal bishop and the business leaders that he selected. So in the context of nonviolence, we were always open, we were always honest, we always told them what we were doing and why. And we helped them work out the solution. So I had been in it from the beginning, and while Dr. King and others were in jail and the marches continued, I'd end up, the demonstrations were in the morning so they could get on the news in New York. We had to get them the news people had to take off by 1 o'clock because you had to fly the news to New York for the 6 o'clock news. So we were through with demonstrations by about 11:30 or 12. And then I'd, change out of my overalls and put on a suit and tie and go down to meet with the business community and the religious leaders. So it was a two-track kind of process. The thing that made Birmingham work, though, was that we said to people, you're being segregated because you are cooperating with segregation. If you stop cooperating with segregation and say, stop spending your money where you can't work, it'll change. And so we had 300,000 people that didn't buy anything but food or medicine for 3 months. Well, that shut down the town economically. And so my negotiations with them were trying to convince them that they could change this simply by changing their rules. And they said, well, we can't do that. It's against the law. I said, well, you don't have to have, there's no such thing as black water and white water. You can take those signs off the water fountains, you know, and you can hire black people. They said, we can't find anybody qualified. You said, well, you have people qualified already working for you. You just have them in maid's uniforms. So let them wear the clothing that they have on the rack and let them get a commission. They know a lot more about your departments than the young girls that you hire from University of Alabama coming in and staying for a few weeks and then going back to school. I said, and you probably find that most of your white customers, when they want something in the store, they go to the maids because they know the maids know where it is and what to get. And so they agreed to try those things, and nobody complained. And then we set up a time when we said, we will send one person a day to the lunch counter. We'll call and let you know when they're going to come and just see what happens. And they'll be trained in nonviolence, and they won't fight back, and they, you know, it was just, and so we did it and nothing happened. And we did that for a solid week. Every day at different times, people would go in and sit down and order a cup of coffee or a hamburger, and they were served, and it went on without incident. So we broke it down piece by piece and helped them understand that it wasn't hard to hire people, that it wasn't hard to take these signs down, that people would, if they were hungry, they'd get something to eat. If they decided not to, they wouldn't. So that, my job was sort of on the negotiation side. But in the morning, I was helping to train the kids and lining them up to go to jail. But I never went to jail in Birmingham.
You didn't want Dr. King to go to Memphis, did you?
I didn't. And we had a notion that, it was his notion that the purpose of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, poverty, and war. And we were doing pretty good on racism, and we'd come out against the war. But we had made no impact on poverty. And he was 38 years old. And I felt like it would have been good for him to take a sabbatical for 2 years. And he had been active from 1955 to that was 1966. And he hadn't had any time off. And I said, and he was offered the opportunity to serve as interim pastor at Riverside Church in New York and teach at Union Theological Seminary. I said, that'd be perfect for you for a couple of years. And recharge your batteries and let this election go through. We can handle things. And you come back out after, well, we didn't know whether it was going to be Lyndon Johnson or later on Bobby Kennedy. McCarthy got in it. And but between the time when we did that, when he didn't take the time off, he ended up getting assassinated. And then shortly after that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And it really destroyed the momentum and we were just shattered. Mm-hmm. And that's when the movement was, I think, it took us a while to recover. Mm-hmm. And we had such strong egos and strong personalities that without him, we couldn't stay together. Mm-hmm. And Jesse had come on with the idea of, the economic integration of the stores and the shelf life and Operation Breadbasket, which started here, which really came from Philadelphia and Reverend Leon Sullivan. I had met with Dr. King and Harry Belafonte, John Conyers, congressman from Michigan, and the mayor of Gary, talking about how we move the energy of this movement into politics. And so we had talked about that. So when all of this was over, that was one of the reasons why, well, I was trying to get Julian to run, and I thought I'd be a good campaign manager. And I always saw myself as the organizer behind the scenes, but when Julian wouldn't run, Harry Belafonte just decided that, well, you run. And I said, no, and he said no, and he set up a fundraising benefit before I even had a chance to talk to my wife about it. And he had Lena Horne and Sidney Poitier and Alan King, and they'd organized a $100 plate dinner in New York to announce my running for Congress.
So you ran for Congress and was elected in 1972.
Lost the first time. Sam Massell asked me to chair the Community Relations Commission, which I did. And that gave me a chance to get to know more people, be involved in community problems. And so in '72 I won. And I loved Congress. But shortly after, Jimmy Carter started thinking about running for president. And I got pulled into that, basically defending him, because he was a good guy. And they wanted to make him a South Georgia cracker.
Yeah.
And I said, well, he's from South Georgia, but he's not what you think he is. And when I think most of the people in the Congress were afraid to take a chance on a Southerner. So they asked me to come to their congressional districts to campaign for them. And that gave me a chance to talk to Jimmy Carter. And so I went to 41 states, not for the Carter campaign, but for the congressman. And I think what I did for Jimmy Carter was just stand up for him. People were afraid to trust somebody from the South, and I think that there was not a lot of respect for Southerners. And I think Lyndon Johnson was affected by that. I think Bill Clinton was affected by that. Folk in New York and New England feel like they're the smartest people in the world. And they are the ones that know all the answers and that we don't know. And I think it's exactly the opposite. I think we have taken on more of the reason I could support Jimmy Carter was I said the problems we face now are race and poverty. Coming from Sumter County, you know more about race and poverty than anybody. I mean, the Kennedys read about it, but they didn't know anything about poverty or race. See, but they had good liberal positions, but Jimmy Carter was his total life.
Well, he became president, and he chose you to be the ambassador to the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen?
Well, a young African student asked him about Azania, Namibia, and Zimbabwe when he was out in California. And he didn't realize, I mean, he was tired and nobody was using those terms yet. And he didn't even know what the guy was talking about. And he came back embarrassed because he soon found out that those were names for South Africa and Rhodesia and Southwest Africa were the names that were used then. But the Africans used Zimbabwe, Azania, and Namibia. And so once he figured that out, he said, you need to advise me on what I need to do. And I said, well, you don't really need any advice. I said, the problems are the same as they are here. And the answers are pretty close. You know about poverty and race. And all you need to say is that democracy and free enterprise are the best antidotes for poverty and racism. And so he started talking about one man, one vote for South Africa, and that Africans should not be written off as communists, that Africa basically was a nation of traders, and they understood free enterprise, and we ought to embrace them. And then he was serious about human rights. And he said, because I had advised him on what to say, he said he wanted me to go with him to the UN because nobody would take us serious, and they might hear me because I was with Martin Luther King.